Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion on domestic intelligence is broken with Donell Harvin. My name is Natalie Cross and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Intelligence Analysis playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Michael Ard, Program Director for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Welcome everyone to Inside Intelligence. Today, our guest is Homeland Security expert Donell Harvin, who's a visiting scientist at Harvard School of Public Health, where he oversees the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative's CBRNE research and training program. He also serves as an adjunct faculty member at Georgetown University, where he teaches terrorism, homeland security, and intelligence. He routinely provides expertise to MSNBC, NBC News, CNN, Politico, INTERPOL, and the UN Office of Counterterrorism. His public safety career spans 30 years and includes executive roles in fire and emergency response, law enforcement, forensics, countering weapons of mass destruction, homeland security, and intelligence. He was a member of the fire department in New York on 9/11. He also provided analysis on the Sandy Hook school shooting and the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, and most recently, WMD disaster-related capacity building activities within Ukraine. Donell holds a graduate degree in emergency management, terrorist studies, and environmental science, and a Doctor of Public Health degree with a focus on environmental epidemiology and biohazards. Welcome to our program. Let's talk about domestic intelligence is broken. It's a provocative title.
I think it's fractured, it's broken. I think in order to understand that title, we have to go back to the beginnings of domestic intelligence. There is the post 9/11 and there's the pre 9/11. I won't get into the pre 9/11 right now. I think it gets a little bit difficult to chew on, particularly since it really revolves around civil rights and civil liberties. And you know, I'll say broadly that the pre 9/11 domestic intelligence really were not as professionally done as they were post 9/11. And so if you have to, you know, fast forward to 9/11 and what happened, we had essentially two agencies that had information about an impending threat that didn't share that information with each other, but certainly didn't share that effectively with the state and locals. And so after the 9/11 Commission, the federal government decided to create a mechanism by which to share that information. Now, in the CIA and the FBI's defense, there was no way to share classified information with state and locals. There were no SCIFs. No one had classification access. No one had clearances. And so that was ameliorated after 9/11 with the creation of the fusion centers. Almost 80 fusion centers, one in every state. Every state has one. Some states have multiple fusion centers based on their kind of risk profile, based on their population density, based on their UASI, Urban Area Security Initiative tier status. And so these fusion centers were really funded to meet the counterterrorism needs of the state and locals by taking classified information that's on the high side and analyzing that and either distributing that to other individuals within the organization or within the government at the state and local level that had access to that. And more broadly to individuals like who I started off as a first responder, FDNY, to provide that information in some type of Tearline product or some type of way that's consumable by need to know individuals without classification. And so, imagine that paramedic, imagine that firefighter, imagine that police officer at roll call with their sergeant or the lieutenant saying, okay, listen up, guys. Besides checking for this and this and this, we got a bulletin from DHS saying that fire could be used as a terrorism weapon. Here goes some photos, right? Here goes what we're seeing. This has all been unclassified, but it started off at the classified, at the high side level, and the Fusion Center's role in that is to step that information down to get it to these individuals that need it on the ground. And so a very lofty goal, but a very worthy goal. Fast forward almost over 20 years, and the Fusion Center, which I think is the bulwark of the domestic intelligence and homeland security enterprise in the United States, is really a tapestry, right? If you're in this business, and I can see some Fusion Center folks here, the old joke: if you see one Fusion Center, you've seen one Fusion Center. Now, the beauty of that, I think the special nature of that, if we want to embrace this, is that it allows intelligence and information flow at the state and local level to look exactly like what the state and locals need. It doesn't have to look like DHS INA. It doesn't have to look like the FBI JTTF. It looks like what the state and locals need it to look like because it's created by the state and locals. But on the bad side, you take two states, one that's particularly not well funded, and one that's really well funded. I'll use two examples, a North Dakota and a California. Maybe they're both meeting the baseline Fusion Center core capabilities, which is not very difficult to do. I was a Fusion Center director. I did those annual reports. It's not hard to check off those boxes to DHS saying that you meet the core capabilities. But these two states have vastly different capabilities, right? And if you look at a low population, low income state, and I'm not picking on South Dakota, but I used to deal with the Fusion Center directors, and he would say, Donell, I got 4 or 5 analysts for the entire state. And are you really fulfilling the mission of a counterterrorism mandate when you have 3 or 4 analysts versus a California that may have hundreds, maybe thousands? I don't know the exact number. And so there's not an equal playing field. So we can take the beauty of kind of the uniqueness of this, the idiosyncratic nature of a Fusion Center at the state and local level and how they've created to make it look like their own, but also compared to as a broader network, they're not all equal. And the last thing I'll say is that there's another layer on top of that. Besides the kind of disparity in capabilities and resources that they're given, once again, we started talking about the UASI tier system, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, right? And all those states, and I was fortunate enough to be in states that were always tier 1. I started off my career in New York, did 20 years in New York, then did DC. So I always had this largesse, to be honest with you, Michael. I never was wanting for resources. If I needed more analysts, I talked to my grant officer and say, hey, I need 4 more analysts. I say, okay, we'll work it into the grant budget. And it just magically appeared. There's also this kind of, and I call it friction, you can call it a disconnect from a policy standpoint between Fusion Centers, in which there are some that are, because of how they've been born, are housed within law enforcement entities. And there's some that are not housed in law enforcement entities. And any law enforcement person in the webinar now knows that there's some information that's beyond classification level that we would normally know, secret, top secret, TSSCI, that is law enforcement sensitive. And if it's generated by a Fusion Center that's housed within a law enforcement operation and is generated from law enforcement information or intelligence, and they put that stamp LES on it, law enforcement sensitive, nobody has access to that information unless you're a sworn law enforcement officer. And so I found myself as the chief of one of the more premier Fusion Centers in the country, and I say premier not because of the quality of our work, but just because of the threat environment that we were operating in, being told by other fusion centers that I can't look at a document, I can't give you access to a document, you can't see or hear this information, nor can your analyst, because you are not a law enforcement fusion center. We were housed in a state emergency management and homeland security operation. And so ostensibly, the chief of Homeland Security and the Homeland Security advisor for the state, or in this particular case, Washington, D.C., myself, had less access to information than a beat cop in another city. And there's no moves or initiatives to create that. And so I'll end with saying, while on 9/11 or 9/10, if you will, we had two agencies that weren't collaborating effectively with each other. Fast forward 24 years now, and we have dozens of agencies that are almost doing the same thing structurally.
Thanks for that intro. Let's talk a little bit about the structure. And I'd like to get back to the fusion centers, Donell, because I think, like you, that this is a very important part of the component and not very well understood by the public. But let's talk about, the principal organization founded after 9/11 was the Department of Homeland Security. Homeland Security Act 2002 gives it a mandate on counterterrorism. However, FBI is the principal counterterrorism, domestic terrorism organization. And then you also have INA, the Intelligence and Analysis, which is set up ostensibly to coordinate the information coming from the fusion centers. It seems like, and this is just my impression, or looking at the record over the last 20 years as I've been doing, is that the impact that DHS has had on the fusion centers has been more persuasive than, or I should say, suggestive than necessarily directive. And is that something that's lacking in this? Does this require something? You focus on how, sorry for the long question, but you focus on how this has really evolved, right? This has been an evolutionary process with the fusion centers and how they've really been adapted for local and state needs. But is this, and that could be part of the problem, right? It isn't getting the type of priority from the feds that it maybe needs to be more effective.
Yeah, I think that's a two-part question for me. The first part I want to address is your comment about the FBI and DHS.
Right.
Each fusion center's relationship with the FBI or the DHS really also depends on who's providing clearances for them. There's some fusion centers that are their staff are sponsoring the clear. So their staff's clearances are sponsored by the Bureau as well as their SCIF, and there's some that their staff and their SCIF may be sponsored by DHS, like mine was. And so you have really just on an organizational level and administrative level, just more hands-on with that agency. So we had DHS coming by annually to do inspections of our SCIF with our safety security officer. Whenever we hired new staff, we would send them to DHS INA to get their training, to get their certification, their classification training, and all that other stuff. So there was just this regular kind of churn that had nothing to do with the work that we were going to be doing together. And so once again, those relationships start solidifying. And so, you have fusion centers out there that have the JTTF, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, either co-located with the fusion center or embedded in the fusion center. And so, you'll find that those relationships are so much more stronger than their relationship with DHS INA is, which is actually also not a law enforcement agency. And so, while I was sitting there as a DC Fusion Center director, opining about the fact that I couldn't get LES information, my colleagues in DHS INA were saying the same thing. The other thing that I lament, and I've met with as many congressmen and senators, staff as I could in their chambers, is the fact that if you look at our threats 9/11, you look at how we kind of evolved after 9/11, it was always about protecting us as Americans from them, right? Who are those people, Michael? Those people overseas. And so really our gaze has always been that way. It's been looking over our borders for the terrorist threat that will penetrate our security and come into the United States or may already be here. And so how we've set these up with these UASI tier 1 cities, tier 2 cities, is that we've given these metropolitan hubs a lot of resources to protect themselves while stripping these smaller jurisdictions that actually we've seen in the last decade is where the domestic threat's coming from. And so let's go back to a state like South Dakota. Not that I'm picking on South Dakota, not that I have any intel on South Dakota, but if you have 5 analysts and you have an anti-government, neo-Nazi hate group that's flourishing in your state, where are your resources for tracking that when they're all in, a New York, an LA, a Miami, to prevent us from transnational terrorists? And when you talked with DHS, they really don't, to your point, they don't dictate how you do business, which is actually a good thing. But it's also kind of a bad thing, because when I go to DHS and I've met with several undersecretaries and I've explained these issues with them, they're just there to help. They're not really there to mandate things. And so without any direction, and I've said this before, we're kind of left with no leadership. We have a director of national intelligence, and when you go to their website and when you meet with their staff and their executives, they don't do domestic intelligence. They say, we support the FBI and the DHS. And so we're really back to, a post 9/11, 9/10 environment where we have to rely on either DHS or FBI to really take leadership. And there's no one been assigned. So, my comment to these executives and to members of Congress is, well, then do we need a domestic DNI? Because you need to be able to point to one person for full accountability to make sure that all the information is analyzed and purveyed in a real strategic and consistent manner, which is not what's happening right now. By and large, I don't want to overstate these things. Like, you have HISN, the Homeland Security Information Network. There's things out there, but any of you know that you've logged on to HISN, it's really about things that are basically public record. There's not going to be anything eye-opening on HISN, but it is a good way to pull things down that are unclassified to share and distribute. But
HISN is the Homeland Security Information Network, and that's open source, right? It's
open source.
Yeah, right. And but over time, though, and I think for our listeners, it's important to emphasize that the fusion centers developed organically. It wasn't something that came necessarily from the feds, although there was some advising role. But basically, this started taking off at the state level and the urban level. And then I guess in around the mid-2000s, they started to say, hey, how can we get this into a network where this works together with the feds? But one thing, what is the information sharing relationship between the fusion centers themselves and DHS or FBI? How is that determined, or is that formalized?
Well, we first have to establish a fact that not all fusion centers are playing in the counterterrorism space. Right? And that's a fact. Now, while fusion centers evolve to meet a counterterrorism mission, if you meet any fusion center director from one of these less funded states or city that's really preoccupied with daily crime, and I used to meet with my colleagues every month and in person twice a year, they will tell you, Donell, it's really good that you're working on this counterterrorism stuff. We love your product. We love your team. But I just had 6 shootings last night, and my mayor's up my you-know-what, and I don't have the analysts or the capabilities or the resources that you have. And so what you've also seen with some of these fusion centers is the mission creep when there's no terrorism happening in that state or that jurisdiction, shifting to real-time crime analysis. And it was happening in DC, believe it or not. The Fusion Center was really just churning out real-time crime-related data, using those capabilities to track day-to-day crime. And to her credit, that police chief, which was Kathy Lanier, and I've had many conversations with her, realized that she said, we're so fully engrossed in meeting the day-to-day security needs of our communities, we can't look strategically, we can't be higher. And she actually took the Fusion Center and gave it up out of her organization, out of DC Police, which is where it was, and gave it to DC Homeland Security, where it can thrive and flourish and be the Fusion Center that it should have been. And she created a real-time crime analysis center to collaborate and coordinate. So you have this real tactical capability, and then that strategic capability that the Fusion Center was able to provide. And so if we take it at face value that not all Fusion Centers are playing in the same sandbox, the next question, to answer your question, is how are they sharing information? Well, there's no formalization process. The first thing I'll say is when I got to the Fusion Center, I got there because I didn't have any intelligence background. I had no background in intelligence. I was an executive in several operations. My last job was I was an executive at the medical examiner's office doing high-end forensics. And I was a consumer. I was one of those people that were reading those products that were sanitized, that were stepped down, that, those Terraline products. And so when I interviewed, I said, hey, I'm not an Intel guy, but I read a lot of stuff and I know what your customers want. And they said, that's exactly what we want, because they wanted to be more customer focused. But when I got there, I said, well, we're just organically generating our own stuff. We're not really getting a lot of stuff from other Fusion Centers. And my staff told me it's because they really keep us at an arm's distance because we don't have that LES status. And so there's multiple layers of this. Even within our jurisdiction, our partners would share information, but they would stop short of sharing LES information. And not because they didn't like us, and not because we hadn't built a relationship, which I think is all important things. I told my students, if you're going to go into this business, no one cares how good you are or how read in you are. At the end of the day, people want to be able to sit like you and I are sitting in front of each other and be able to relate with you as a human being. And so if you can work in your interpersonal skills, you've kind of won. It wasn't because they didn't like us, it's because they actually had systemic, structural, and in some cases, legal impediments from sharing LES information with non-LES organizations. And we can talk about how I overcame that later. But when I went to DHS and said, hey, this Fusion Center basically told us they're not sharing information on us and they can share it with our PD. And if our PD wants to share it with us, they can. What do? DHS was completely hands off. They said, we don't regulate that. That's not in our kind of mandate. We just create the environment for there to be a network. And so the network isn't what people think it is. The network is a collection of Fusion Centers that work with each other in a very transactional, often way, in a regional way, but not in a holistic nationwide way. And the first time that actually had ever happened, that the Fusion Center was credited for really fusing, was on January 4th, when I reached out to over the weekend. I had reached out to the president of the National Fusion Center Association, Mike Senna, and I said, Mike, I'm in over my head with this January 6th stuff. I'm scared. I remember that day like it was yesterday. I was in the shopping center and I was walking up the aisles to do some shopping. It was a Saturday, and I was in the shopping market for about 15 minutes. And I looked down, I had one thing in my cart. And I said, I'm preoccupied. And so I literally stopped, called Mike and said, Mike, I don't know what I'm doing. And so he said, okay, tell me what your problem is. We'll fix it. And on Monday, by Monday, over the weekend, he put out a call to the Fusion Center saying, hey, we're going to have a joint call with the DC Fusion Center about a threat they're tracking for January 6th. We'd like you guys to jump on. On Monday, I found that every single Fusion Center in the country, including Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, were there, over 300 individuals. And Mike tasked them with all collecting, analyzing, and disseminating threat information about DC and January 6th directly to my Fusion Center, and to overcome whatever issues they had. And so that really was an eye-opener for us and many people in the administration that this could work, provided there was a mandate. Mike just did it because he had those relationships and he has that cachet with the Fusion Centers, but really it was optional for them to show up.
Right, he was the director of the National Association, and he's the head of one fusion center
Correct.
in Northern California.
They could have told him, they could have politely listened to the call and say, okay, well, that's nice, Mike, kick rocks. But they didn't. We were flooded after that with help, with information. At the end of the day, it didn't help January 6th. But if you want to look at a silver lining from January 6th and all the information intelligence we collected, analyzed, disseminated around there, that shows that the proof of concept, which is a unified system of fusion centers working at the state and local level, working collaboratively, it can work. It just needs a mandate to do so. The DHS doesn't have that mandate. The fusion center funding that's appropriated every year, which is why I go to Congress, why I've tried to work with Congress in the Homeland Security subcommittee to try to get that baked into the funding. It doesn't have that in the funding. So there's only carrots in the funding for the fusion centers. There's no sticks. And there's no provision saying you must share information. In fact, I learned that from DHS. They're like, Donell, there's fusion centers that don't share information from us, and we help fund them. And so that's why I say the system is broken. It's almost there, but it's fractured. And in these fractures, I think, lies our next 9/11.
Let's talk a little bit, though, about, you mentioned the JTTFs, and we have a big network of JTTFs. They're focused on the, exclusively, I think, on the counterterrorism. They are operational. I follow some of the arrests that are going on. I don't think I see all the criminal complaints, but I get a lot in my inbox from what I subscribe to track this. Seems to work. Doesn't catch obviously some people come through the cracks, as we saw on the 1st of January, right? Where we had the worst terrorist attack in probably 9 years. But so could one say, look at that and say, well, we do have this system, it's operational, it's working. Do we need the fusion centers to focus on that?
Well, the issue is that if there's no stick and there's no provisions, and if you take me at my word that to be a fusion center, there's a pretty low bar, right? Because DHS kind of has a checklist, and how many products have you disseminated jointly with another fusion center or another organization. I mean, it's not that hard to recertify as a fusion center. Then they're really operating at the whim of the director of the fusion center. So an individual like me, and I would wake up every day and yawn and say, okay, what are the threats facing DC? I had that latitude. My boss never told me what to do. Once in a while, he would say, hey, met with the mayor, met with some folks in the Hill. They're interested in this. Can you assign some resources to it? And I would say, no problem, Chris. But I was never in his office every day saying, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? That's not the case for every fusion center director. They don't have the latitude. Some have bars of stars on their shoulders, and they reply to a police chief. Right. And so it really is up to the idiosyncrasies of the jurisdiction, what they want to use those resources for. And when you don't have federal oversight that's mandated beyond the basic checklist of what they're producing and who they're disseminating it to, then this is what you have. I'd also add that latter part, who they're disseminating to. There are some fusion centers that solely exist just for a law enforcement mission. And I'm not saying that to disparage them. But what you've seen is a backlash to this, and I can name jurisdictions that their fire department, their EMS, their Homeland Security office that are civilian non-gun, non-badge holders have created their own fusion center-like capabilities. There are dozens of fire departments out there that are using OSINT and creating their own products because they can't get any information from the fusion centers, as well as state emergency management agencies. Because the fusion centers are supposed to be all hazards, and we had an all hazard fusion center where I was, but many of them aren't. They're focused on the man-made hazard and not all hazards. And so, this disconnect between fusion centers at a national level, between fusion centers and their federal partners, between federal partners and each other, and then fusion centers and their constituencies, the people they're supposed to be serving, the fire, the EMS, the rescue, the emergency management, the homeland security agencies within their state or their local jurisdictions, they're not being met. So there's a lot of issues from top to bottom that I think, in my personal opinion, those gaps can be closed legislatively. The people are there, the capabilities are already there. They just need to be directed to do what the mission was after 9/11. But we've gotten so far away from 9/11 that we've lost sight of why we're here.
We are going to take some questions from everybody. Please put your questions actually in the Q&A function or the chat. We talked a little bit about priorities. Do you think that the fusion centers, Aaron raises this, do you think the fusion centers are focusing on domestic extremism adequately?
Aaron, that's a good question. And once again, it all depends on where your fusion center is located. So I'll give you an example. Our fusion center was keenly focused on domestic extremism. And so much so that I had a domestic extremism desk. I had an analyst that was doing that almost full time. Came up with a really good, a really compelling intel product. We shared it with another federal agency. I won't mention the agency's name, to co-seal on that intel product. And at some point during the review process, it was leaked, got to the White House, and found its way on President Trump's desk. And it was a intel product that was about the Boogaloo Boys. And I found out that it was leaked because I saw that on Politico. Intel product from DC Fusion Center says that the Boogaloo Boys, an accelerationist group, are a huge threat. And so I had seen previously in the chat, someone talked about distrust. There is distrust because of things like that. It all depends on what your mayor, your police chief, your governor wants you to look at and what resources you have, Aaron. And it also depends on what, and we haven't talked about this, every state and every major jurisdiction does what we call a THIRA, which is an annual threat and hazard and risk assessment, right? They look at what are their risks in their area, their region, their area of responsibility, AOR, and they create this matrix. It's kind of standardized boilerplate, FEMA, DHS type of stuff. And that's how they apply for grants, but they also report back to the powers that be to what they're looking at. And if domestic extremism is not high on that THIRA, it's someone else's problem and it's not their problem. And this is where I think a DHS or FBI can step in and say, hey, we're really concerned about that. Now, I also want to say, because Aaron's point is really good, and we didn't get to this, Michael, the relationships at a very macro level, the ecosystem at a macro level for domestic intelligence relies on DHS has a ton of information and data that they can't do anything with. And I'm being hyperbolic, but they can't do a lot with. They collect far, far more intelligence and information than the FBI does, particularly because they control our borders. And so they're sitting there with this pile of gold. Think of like, the dragon from, the Lord of the Rings, sitting there in this pile of gold that they can't even do anything with. And that's where the fusion centers come in. So they have this really 30,000 foot view, and they'll send some of this stuff down to the state or local fusion centers and saying, hey, we're seeing this. Can you analyze this? And can you feed that information back up to us? It's almost like if any of you guys study the human's nervous system, DHS is the brain, and the fusion centers become like the fingers, the sensory organs. They can tell at a real micro level, DHS, if what they're seeing at the macro level makes sense. They can help them contextualize their data. And the FBI kind of falls somewhere within there. Keep in mind that there's also this, and I'm not speaking bad about the FBI, there's also this very, I'm gonna call it perverse. My brother's an FBI agent, most of my friends are FBI agents. There's a perverse incentive structure for FBI agents who are doing this mission to share information and intelligence. And the perverse structure is, if they have information and intelligence, their inclination is to not share and hold on to it because they have to make their case, and making cases is how they move up the ladder. DHS doesn't have that structure. And they will share information, threat information, if it's life-threatening or imminent threat right? They'll get permissions to do that. But by and large, if we're both tracking a threat and you speak to your local FBI person, they may just nod their head. And we saw that a lot on January 6th and other things. Like, yeah, we're tracking that. We're tracking that. There's an active case. We can't talk about it because if they release that information, it can compromise their sources, their methods. We get that. But it also can compromise their career. Whereas DHS is purely there for the Homeland Security, INA is purely there to share information. They really don't have a horse in the race. And so that also kind of defines the relationship you're going to have with either DHS, INA, or your local JTTF. And that's not speaking bad about anyone. That's just the structures of how these individual agencies have come about. There's more incentive for DHS to share information. I've met, regional administrators of DHS, and they've moved up the ladder by sharing information and collaborating and getting great feedback from their partners. It's not the same on the Bureau side. Their job is to have information to track down the bad guys who keep people safe.
Let's talk about threat priorities now. We've seen a big shift from the federal government on what they're considering domestic priorities right now. How do we think that the current domestic intelligence apparatus, such as it is, will be able to cope with sort of a new threat matrix?
To put it bluntly, I am concerned, and I don't say that to be the guy who says the sky is falling. I'm concerned because of everything we've talked about heretofore in the last 35 minutes has been that the Fusion Center, which once again is the working horse of our domestic intelligence, our domestic homeland security, they're already overwhelmed with state and local issues. Many of them are not meeting, and they may not say this publicly, but if you get a Fusion Center director in a room with a stake, they'll tell you we can't meet that foreign terrorist organization threat. We rely on some of the bigger Fusion Centers or our federal partners to help us contextualize that threat. And now you expand that threat to include foreign criminal organizations, drug trafficking organizations, and gangs. And when you put, and I'll be very blunt with you, when you put a TDA or an MS-13 at the same level as Daesh or Al-Qaeda, it does a disservice to the people who are actually doing the groundwork on this, because they're not the same. When I started learning terrorism 22, 23 years ago after 9/11, when everyone was starting to get involved in this, I remember my professor to this day said, you know domestic terrorists when you see a domestic terrorist, right? These transnational criminal organizations have a unifying goal, and that's to make more money and to continue to make money. Our foreign terrorist organizations like Daesh and Al-Qaeda have a unifying goal, which is apocalyptic violence and killing as many people as possible. Now, they make money to do that, right? So there's some cross, and the foreign terrorists or foreign criminal organizations kill people to make money, but their unifying goals are completely different. But when you tell that to state and locals and you shift your focuses to tracking down these criminal organizations, it shifts their focus as well. And so I am concerned that this expansion of what a terrorist is, and we haven't even talked about the fact that we're there's a lot of rhetoric out there over the last 2 to 3 months on the domestic terrorist side, calling people who vandalize or violent protesters domestic terrorists. I'm not saying that they're not. We can't get into that discussion now with the time that we have. What I'm saying is that we have a big terrorist problem then, and we need more people in the counterterrorism space. If we have that many, if we have these, MS-13, TDA, and all these other groups that are terrorists, and then anyone that scratches up a Tesla or is part of a violent protest is also a terrorist. I'm not making a political statement. Well, then we need more people to track these, or we need to focus on what really is the threat concern.
Right.
So we're not there yet, I think.
And does that all then become an FBI issue?
Well,
right, because they've got the lead on domestic terrorism.
I'll tell you, I was also in charge of my critical infrastructure portfolio, which many fusion centers can't do. And my critical infrastructure guy used to say, well, here goes the list of all the critical infrastructure in DC. And I'm like, man, that document's 40 pages long. I would say, Mark, if this is all critical, then what's really critical? He's like, if everything's critical, then what's critical, right? And so your point's well taken. A lot of the fusion centers will align with the mission of their law enforcement colleagues or their DHS colleagues. And that really is now with these transnational criminal organizations that have been labeled as terrorist organizations. So you'll find, and I'm hearing this from my fusion center colleagues across the country and federal colleagues, is that while, I actually was talking to someone from the JTTF in a state, they ran that JTTF, they said, this time last year, I was tracking down individuals that were radicalized by Daesh, ISIS online. And now I'm tracking down illegals that are assigned, that may or may not be aligned to MS-13. And he said, fine, I'll do that, but I'm not looking at those individuals. I can't do both.
Right.
And so I need another person that's doing that or something. And so everyone's just overworked. And I want to be very, very clear that I'm not making a value statement or political statement on whether MS-13 is a terrorist organization or not. What I'm saying is that if we're going to make them a terrorist organization, if we're also going to start labeling domestic terrorists as vandalists and people who are committing violent crimes on the other spectrum, domestic terrorists, I'm fine with that. We need more people to do this job. Concurrently, and we haven't talked about this, the current budget proposal is looking like it's stripping the fusion centers, right? So while we're expanding what is a threat, the definition of what a threat is, it's looking like UASI and SHISHIP funds, these Homeland Security funds, are going to be either shrunk or eliminated. I don't know how you do both.
Barbara raised in the chat, and by the way, a very, very good dialogue going on in the chat. Ask a question, and we'll answer it. We'll try it. The point about 30th anniversary of Oklahoma City bombing, right, 1995. Worst terrorist event in the U.S. until 9/11. Do we need? Are we in a sad situation where we'll need something of this magnitude to try to pull together the type of coordination that we're going to need on this?
Yeah, and that's a sad commentary. I say this every semester to each one of my classes. It's usually week 1 or 2. Unfortunately, in our business, someone has to die for any movement to happen. Now, that's not always generally true. You can look at all these school shootings and very little's happened. But someone has to die or suffer in order for this machine to move. I will say, however, with the recent presidential directive that designated some of these foreign criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations, one thing that the Trump administration's been able to do very effectively that no one's been able to do is to actually get these federal organizations working together at a very tactical and strategic level. And so while you used to see single while you would see single agency raids, you would see, DOJ raids that would use, FBI, U.S. Marshals, perhaps, ATF or something like that. Now you're seeing DHS working with the DOJ to do these kind of joint raids. So hopefully that type of coordination collaboration will stick beyond the presidential directive, because that's something I've been calling for a long time. They're doing that to track down illegals, and it's creating this kind of co-working environment between these two agencies that really haven't worked collaboratively heretofore, and I think that's a positive thing.
Got a couple of questions here I want to address. You want to ask about the pros and cons of former military in both the full spectrum and smaller fusion centers. Do you see that a lot? Are there fusion centers recruiting a lot of former military? I mean, it's a sort of a military concept.
Yeah, in my fusion center, off the top of my head, at any given time, we had 3 or 4 former military. Obviously, DoD intelligence is totally different than it is on the domestic side, right? We're not, creating targeting packages, and we have civil rights and civil liberties. But those individuals, they're easily trained and transition very, very well into the homeland security space. And so if you can get your hands on someone who's trained in intelligence in the military side, it may be a bumpy, and you speak to them later on, it's like, hey, it's a hard transition because we had our oversights, but it's completely different. Civil liberties, civil rights, those checks we didn't have. We had different oversights, deconfliction, making sure that we weren't killing the wrong person, but they'll tell you that transition was difficult for them, but from a management administrative standpoint, we see these individuals as great assets, particularly because they've already sworn an oath to protect the homeland. And so they already have that kind of mission space. They're just doing it on the homeland now as opposed to overseas.
Another question from Aaron about, is there a structure in the US? Is there something we can turn to for in the federal government or even this National Guard structure, the DoD structure that might serve, that we could mimic as a domestic intelligence framework?
I think, and no one talks about this at all, I think a really good fusion center concept could come out of the National Guard. So Aaron kind of hit it with the last part. And some National Guards have, I think most of them do, but the ones I've dealt with, so that's why I say some. So if you want to fact check me that all of them do, that's fine. But most of the ones I've dealt with, they have an intelligence officer. And since the National Guard straddles that line between the federal government and protecting the states, they're really well positioned. In fact, one of my fusion center analysts was also a part-time National Guard intelligence officer. So I loved him to death, right? Mm-hmm. They are squarely right in the bullseye target of that mission space of collaborating with the federal government and understanding collection and analysis and contextualization of this information at the federal side, and then working with the state and locals. And so if these fusion centers start being disrupted by policy changes, particularly in the funding space, I think the last line of effort would be for the governors to allocate monies to have resources baked into their National Guards or buttress those resources to take that de facto role. I think they're really well positioned. But once again, I would caution you, DoD intelligence and how they're trained is different. It's not insurmountable. I saw it as a seamless transition, but there needs to be retraining because these guys are dropping, bombs on heads on the DoD side. And on our side, we're doing, if you see something, say something, and doing suspicious activity reporting. And so the mission space for protecting the homeland, the spectrum is so vast. These folks plug in nicely, but you're just going to really have to train them up and find a good space for them.
Putting on your hat here as in looking at various hazards and threats in the US, what do you think now we should be focused on? I mean, we're talking about the threat environment here and your background, which is also looking at a lot of the biohazards and things like that. Yeah. Are we ignoring some things that we should be giving more attention to?
Well, I always start, my preface is I don't like to prognosticate, but that's what I get paid to do when I go on the media or go speaking. I'm actually going to be in Chicago tomorrow speaking to a group of, and we never talk about business leaders or Fortune 500 companies in these conversations. We should, because the private sector often leads the way or is on the front line. And what I'm going to be talking about, I think, is our over-the-horizon threat that's already here is the insider threat. Mm-hmm. If you spoke to any private or public sector leadership before, the 2024 election and before DOGE, they would say that the insider threat detection and mitigation is something they struggle with. I think with the shift in focus of the administration, with the huge emphasis placed on the work of DOGE, I think that this may be hyperbole, so I'm going to give myself a little a side door on this. But I think that you're going to find there's a lot of disgruntled federal workers out there that are primed to be manipulated or perhaps be turned on. And we've started seeing this. There's recent reporting that's open source from DHS and FBI suggesting that our foreign adversaries, China and Russia, are reaching out to these individuals on social media platforms like LinkedIn. They were always very engaged in LinkedIn. We actually did an Intel product on that in 2018, how China had ops on LinkedIn for individuals like me, people who are silly enough, not that I was silly enough, but people who are silly enough to put, hey, my name is John Doe, I have TSSCI clearance, right? And I'm open for work, right? Like you actually log on in LinkedIn, you see these people, right? And these people make themselves targets because they have no OPSEC. And so you're finding that a lot of people who aren't just displaced from the federal workforce, but who are going to work or logged in right now as we're speaking and scared to death that they're not going to be able to feed their family tomorrow and that they're on the chopping block. That's a rich environment to compromise someone who has access, or someone who has access to someone who has access. And so I think the threat that we're going to be looking at over the next year that I'm actually currently writing an op-ed on is the insider threat, which we had problems with before.
Question I have is trying to look at this in its totality. Is this just part of our American aversion to the idea of domestic intelligence, that we don't want to go that far, that we won't give fusion centers enough of a mandate or resources? Because I mean, honestly, civil rights groups don't like them.
Yeah.
There's a lot of criticism in the media. Are we Americans just simply too skittish about even saying domestic intelligence?
Well, domestic intelligence is a double-edged sword. And, I would say yes, up until like yesterday, where, we have this new presidential directive that basically, I'll read it for you because my memory's not as good. Strengthening and unleashing America's law enforcement to pursue criminals and protect innocent citizens. That just came out like 2 days ago. Right. And so I would urge everyone to consume that. I encourage my students to read presidential directives. While they're not law, it really talks about policy priorities and operational priorities. And so what I would say is this: we are scared to death. Civil libertarians are scared to death of fusion centers, as they should be. We have in our domestic enterprise the potential to have the second largest domestic spying operation in the world. The first is the Chinese. What many folks don't know, and I'm probably going to break some tea here, is that in many of your UIC Tier 1 cities, law enforcement has access to private cameras. How do they do that? They have written agreements. Perhaps in many cities or states, they provide those cameras to businesses with the agreement that they have direct access to those IPs, and they can just basically live stream that stuff. These cameras are facial recognition quality. So while your government may be saying we don't use facial recognition, the capability is out there. It's basically turning on the switch, right? The camera I'm talking to you on is facial recognition quality. It's a software and the permissions that are happening in the background that allow it to be facial recognition. And so when you look at this kind of Orwellian, hellscape that we've all learned about, it's already here. What it requires is leadership to say, we're going to go full bore on this and allow or unleash law enforcement to do whatever is necessary. There has never been equilibrium between civil rights and civil liberties and protecting the public. And at every really pivotal point of our Homeland Security mission, there have been times where the people say, hey, I want to be protected. Forget about those civil liberties and civil rights. Protect me. And so it's a seesaw because you can't do both, unfortunately. And what do we have? We have like 9/11 legislation. We have the Patriot Act. And people saying, I don't care, just protect us from them. And then eventually, as the threat goes down, people are like, hey, I want my liberties back. Don't domestically spy on us, right?
Right.
And you see, BLM circa 2020, laws restricting police officers from protecting us to protect our civil rights and civil liberties. And so there's this pendulum that always it has some friction, and you just have to read the tea leaves and be unaware of where we're going next. And I think we're going to the decreased civil rights, civil liberties space. And that's not going to be good because, and I'll stop with this. I used to always tell my Fusion Center staff on their first day, if you had a choice between protecting civil rights and civil liberties or protecting the public, and you were given that stark choice, what would you choose? And they all chose the wrong thing. They said, we would protect the public. We would, to damn be with civil rights and civil liberties. They'll get over it. They'll be alive. And I said, that's the wrong answer, because as a Fusion Center, we rely on that phone ringing. And that phone ringing is the public. And if they don't trust you, then you're out of business, because our number one counterterrorism tool in this country is the public. It's not the fancy Fusion Centers and their OSINT aggregators and and everything we can do and federal agents with badges and SWAT teams. It's the public. And when you lose the public's trust, you've lost your homeland security enterprise.
And so much is this depending on essentially the public being involved, right? With even with what gets fed into the Fusion Centers from suspicious activity reporting and things like that. I mean, we're expecting the public to be part of the sensory network. So if that's the case, are we doing a good enough job of informing the public of what the threats are out there and how they can do something about it?
No, because my criticisms of the Fusion Centers is the same criticism I have in many federal agencies. They don't actually self-promote, right? And so that's why you can see these deep cuts in, we can name the federal agency, FEMA's a great one, right? Like during times of peace, when there's no war that they're fighting in terms of natural or man-made disasters, are you out there in the community talking about the great work that you did during the last disaster? The Fusion Centers operate in silence. That's how they like it. But at the end of the day, when you trip up, you slip up and you do something wrong and get accused of domestic spying, like several Fusion Centers have done, and the public comes for you with pitchforks and torches, who's there defending you? Nobody. And so they don't do a very good job. You'll see these posters. If you see something, say something. You don't realize when you pick up that phone, that information is going to a Fusion Center. They're completing a suspicious activity report on your behalf, or maybe you're doing it online. And that's how the wheels get turning. You don't even know what a Fusion Center is. Go to 99% of the American public and ask them what a Fusion Center is, and they're not going to know. And so I think the Fusion Centers are primed to get plucked because they don't do any self-promoting. And I think that's to their discredit.
All right, I'm gonna one last question from Russ here about you talked about legislation. You touched on that. What Congress would do to get involved in a perfect world, right? Because we might be actually moving in another direction in this, but in a perfect world, if you had a chance to help to craft legislation to strengthen the Fusion Center network, what would you do?
I would start off I think the network's there. The people are there. They're great. I would create a mandate for them to share information with each other and then share information with the federal government. And I would create a backdoor way for them to get out of the legislative or legal issues they have with sharing LES information with other non-Fusion Centers. In 10 seconds, I'll tell you what I did. I said, I can't play that game. I need to have this threat information. So I went through the arduous process of crafting legislation at the state and local level to designate my Fusion Center as a law enforcement agency. I actually went at the tender age of 40-something to the police academy and became a sworn law enforcement officer because the DOJ said you needed to have at least one person as a sworn law enforcement officer. And we got designated by the DOJ as a law enforcement entity. And that opened the doors. That's the type of shell game I needed to play. No one's carrying badges or guns, right? But I was able to go to these LES Fusion Centers and say, hey, we're designated now, share information with us. And we shouldn't have to do that. There should be easier ways. I think the public thinks that they have a domestic intelligence and homeland security enterprise that they paid for in the hundreds of billions of dollars post 9/11 that they actually don't have. And they're only going to find that out with the next 9/11.
Unfortunately. All right, well, that's a rather ominous way to end this, but listen, great discussion today. Thank you so much, Donell, for your candor and your energy on this, and your insights, and everybody else who participated in the chat. Very interesting. I was trying to keep up with you. We will have this discussion posted on our YouTube site in a few days, and thanks very much for being our guest today, Donell.
My pleasure. And I'm going to type in my email in the chat, or you can share it. You have it as well.
Get in touch.
Yep.
And
Thank you so much.
yeah, we'd like to, we'll follow up on this. And I'd like to mention everybody, in May, we will not be doing an Inside Intelligence because we're getting ready for graduation, everything stops. So, but we will be working on some more for the summer. We are looking at getting a discussion on briefing senior policymakers on the importance of liaison and intelligence work. And I also want to get something set up on just the intelligence and criminal gangs like MS-13. We have an expert on that, talk about that type of activity. So keep an eye out for Inside Intelligence coming up. We thank our guests again. Thanks for all joining us, and look forward to seeing you all again.